Welcome back to Legitimate Targets, everybody. I hope you're all having a wonderful day. Joining me on today's episode is Mats Nilsson, who is a Swedish journalist and geopolitical commentator. He focuses on international relations, on NATO expansion, the Russia-Ukraine war, and basically has been exemplifying as of late how much Europe is screwing themselves on the international stage by failing to pursue peace with Russia, okay? Now, to start off with, Mats, thank you so much for joining me. I want to ask you about how committed you really believe Europe is to blocking a peace with Russia, blocking this U.S.-Russia peace talk effort. And, you know, what I think of is and what I'm reminded of when I ask you this are the comments of former NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg, who said, you know, wait 4 to 5 years until Trump is gone, and you're going to see something really crazy happen in this world. It kind of seemed like he was being very obvious about the fact that over the next 4 years, we're going to be in a dormant session of our NATO aggression. But thereafter, what do you think about all this?
Most definitely. I think they aren't really waiting for Trump to be gone, because I think they have sensed the fact that Trump can be quite erratic in his posture. So somehow I believe that Europe are going along, or they're keeping on target, as to speak. So Europe, and especially its leadership in Brussels, London, Paris, and the Baltic states, are hard at work blocking any path to peace, and they're doing this by officially subordinating to the foreign policy and the Washington agenda. So Europe is definitely not pursuing any strategic interests that we may have, which would logically favor a very swift negotiated settlement to ensure, one, energy stability, and two, an economic stability. Instead, the EU continues to be led by the US long war strategy, looking to weaken Russia. Now, this is a catastrophic strategic error for Europe. So, and we're doing this by providing endless weapons and funding with no coordination for diplomatic engagement. We're just saying, as long as it takes, and we're avoiding the talks with Russia, or even facilitating talks between Ukraine and Russia. So Europe is removing any incentive for Kyiv to seek a negotiated compromise. So that, let's see, Europe is basically a perpetual sponsor of this conflict, and it's a conflict it cannot win on the battlefield. So while it's impossible to win anything on the battlefield, Europe is draining its own economy, is in the process, and blocking the path to peace. So the potential peace, we had it perhaps during the earlier Minsk agreement, but now we're just along for the long-term war, which is based on an anti-Russian ideology that it's been intertwined in the European psyche for many a century. Unfortunately, but that's the way I see it.
Do you think that Europe is risking its disintegration at all by continuing this push for war against Russia? Because if you look at the Trump administration officials, a lot of them are speaking about Europe, saying Europe is dying, Europe is already dead. You have Trump, who is speaking with European countries on a country-by-country basis rather than as the unified bloc that it claims to be through Brussels. I'm curious, you know, where Europe really can go from here, as it's suffering economically, culturally, and now on a geopolitical front with the United States. What would presume to be its main partner is now beginning to say that the curtains are closing. What do you think about that?
It's difficult to say. That there is definitely no unified front, and Europe is definitely going to see ruptures within its organization. It's it's already hitting hard on the countries that dare deviate from the official policies. And there, of course, I'm referring to Slovakia and Hungary, which have both these countries have recently been threatened with legal shenanigans. Let me call them that, because they're not really official. It's not an official policy for the European Union to do this against member states that want to pursue their own foreign policy. But suddenly, on the specifics of Ukraine, Brussels are hitting these countries hard. You might notice that any country that breaks the official line, which is no official line in relations to Palestine, nothing happens. But as soon as any country within the EU steps out of line concerning Ukraine, Brussels hits hard on those countries. And once you do this, the legitimacy of the European Union starts to crackle and will probably disintegrate. So given that energy, which is the backbone of the European welfare, it's been our capacity to gain energy and then produce export goods that are needed. But suddenly we don't have the energy. So given this in combinations, I would say that Europe is definitely causing its own demise and in the long run its own destruction. Instead of looking east, we're trying to tie ourselves to the Washington Empire in a time when we need to decouple from Washington in order to remain significantly independent. We're losing our independence.
If you could speak about this new coalition of the willing, because I struggle to understand how there's any real meaningful differences between something like this, a coalition of the willing, and a NATO occupation of Ukraine, given that, of course, the countries who are in the coalition of the willing are all NATO countries, without any sort of Chinese or Saudi troops present in this peacekeeping efforts that could happen, I guess, in Ukraine. This would be all NATO troops. It wouldn't be any countries that have the best interests of Russia in mind. And it would obviously be seen as an assault on Russia's territorial claims. So what do you make of this? And are there real ramifications if the coalition of the willing decides that they want to move forward with this plan to deploy their troops here?
Very much so. The international lawyer in me can see quite a few crucial distinctions here. One, NATO operates on the principle of collective defense. It's the famous Article 5. An attack on one is considered an attack on all, triggering a unified response. I mean, this is a formal treaty-bound obligation. I mean, and crucially, NATO has not invoked Article 5 for Ukraine because it's not a member. So therefore, the coalition of the willing is an ad hoc, informal alliance outside NATO structure. So it would likely be led by, I would say, perhaps Britain, Poland, the Baltic states, and other hawkish NATO members, but its actions would not be mandated by the North Atlantic Council. So this setup kind of allows for participating countries to bypass the need of a full NATO consensus, which obviously would be impossible to achieve considering members like Turkey, Hungary, and Slovakia. So it's a way for the most pro-interventionist forces and states to act without being vetoed. And it can also, by doing this, it can be focused on specific tasks like training, logistics, limited air defense. So you can, with a coalition of the willing, you can tailor each mission instead of having a NATO scope, which means a broad, all-inclusive military operation. And also, this is important, the coalition of the willing will be funded, which each state giving its own contribution, which will make it easier for the parliaments to push through and allow this to happen. So there are major differences between this, but I think this is just another way of being able to continue the conflict and not risk a de-escalation.
Now, if the UK is involved in the leadership position of this coalition of the willing, you obviously wouldn't need unanimous consent for any action that's taken by the coalition. But you mentioned the question of Italy. What will Italy contribute? They're saying we won't contribute troops, but do you think that some of these coalition partners will say, okay, we're not going to contribute offensive action, but we'll contribute defensive action or training or things of this nature? And really, when you break it down, it's a gray area. There's not a lot to sparse through when you apply these very vague definitions on what a country is contributing to the coalition and its presence in Ukraine.
Perhaps, but you have to remember that the definition of defensive and offensive is now long since in the realm of the Orwellian newspeak. I mean, you're actually talking about defensive grenades these days. So, of course, anything can be sold to the public as being defensive. But returning to the EU and the coalition of the willing, I think the coalition of the willing it's designed precisely to act without the European Union consensus. So for the EU to launch any common military mission or take a unified stance, it would require unanimity amongst 27 members, which of course you're not going to get. So France, Poland, and other hawkish states, they can retain their sovereign right to deploy its military troops and send them abroad, meaning they don't need permission from anyone to do this, especially not the European Commission or European Council. So a group of these nations within the coalition can bilaterally send military advisors. Now, military advisors have been very useful since the time of Vietnam to train and even take part as combat troops in Ukraine under this banner, and thereby bypassing all of the European Union institutional structure. Of course, enhancing the conflict in this way will, of course, hurt European Union economy, but that's nothing that they care that much about. And I mean, you have to remember, I believe you remember the coalition of the willing that was put together by George Bush after the 9/11 attacks. And these coalitions of the willing are put together in order to facilitate military action where the countries know they're not going to gain consensus on the military intervention. So it's just an old playbook move.
Another question I have for you is about President Putin's recent offer to Zelensky to actually come to Moscow, and he'd be coming for discussions on negotiations, not for surrender. And he gave him security guarantees that he would not be arrested. I mean, that'd be a flagrant escalation if Russia were to do something like that at a time when really they have no reason to escalate in a manner such as that. But Zelensky said no. He said, I'm not going to come. How do you think this reflects in the White House? Because to me, it looks like you have Russia bending over backward to try and appease the most, ludicrous demands of the Ukrainians, saying, look, we will host you. We don't feel comfortable coming over there because you're not giving us any security guarantees. You're saying that Putin should be hung and, tried for all his crimes and he should be held accountable, whatever that means. Insane stuff. But we offered you to come here. We offered you security guarantees. We offered you talks, and they refuse. How do you think the White House is viewing that?
It's difficult to say. I mean, Putin went to Alaska knowing that no matter what happened, he would come out looking like a winner. The risk for having this meeting was all on Trump. And I think the inability to follow through on some of the things said at the Alaska meeting has proven I had quite a negative view on this meeting. I went on record saying I don't think anything much is going to come of it. And I think that the weeks that have passed since this meeting have sadly proven me right on this point. Putin obviously knew what Zelensky would do and wouldn't do. Putin knows that Zelensky is dependent on perpetual warfare in order to be able to reclaim or remain in a position of power. So Putin knows where this is heading, and Putin and Russia are sticking to what they said before. Russia has its demands for a neutral Ukraine and a denazification of Ukraine, and they're not going to move from that. So any troops that the European countries will put in Ukraine prior to a peace deal will be legitimate targets. And if this is enough to deter the coalition of the willing, time will tell. I don't think it is, but perhaps they just have to test Russian resolve before the European coalition of the willing learn this the hard way.
You know, you brought up the Article 5 point earlier, and I wanted to ask you about that again, because let's say you have France who sends a brigade of their troops to Ukraine under the auspices of peacekeeping, and then 5 minutes into their deployment, they have a close encounter with a Hinkle missile coming their way. Is that not Article 5 triggering? Does that not trigger some sort of NATO action in response if you have French troops, official French troops, wearing French military uniform, participating in an operation of the French government, who get struck by a Russian missile? What would be the legal protection there that would prevent an Article 5 being triggered?
I don't think so, because you have to remember that it's a matter of if NATO forces are involved in certain actions and they are attacked, it's not per se automatically triggers Article 5. I mean, French forces have been involved in quite a number of actions where they've been attacked, which hasn't triggered Article 5 because it's been purely a French decision to send these forces. The major concern is that the coalition of the willing are engaging in a very dangerous game of chicken, believing that Putin will back down from a broader war. And I see this is a catastrophic miscalculation of Russian red lines and resolve. They will, of course, not back down. Now, and if these troops enter Ukraine before a peace deal or a ceasefire has been achieved, they will most definitely be targets. So I would like to see a constraint from the leaders within the European Union, because official deployment will mean entry of our nations, European nations or coalition of the willing nations into the war. Now, the one thing that you could reason concerning this is that if the if the coalition of the willing actually sends its young men and women to Ukraine, that means they have finally at least left this moral ambiguity towards the war. And by that I mean the coalition of the willing have been happy to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian men and women to fight Russia, which of course is just detestable. But if they should send their own forces, their own young men and women to Ukraine to fight Russia, at least they have come to the conclusion that they believe Russia to be such a huge threat to their own countries that they need to sacrifice their sons and daughters, which is at least a clarification about how deeply the Russophobia actually runs within certain countries within the European Union. Because obviously Russia has no interests of going any further west than Odessa and perhaps the outskirts of Kiev. It's just plain lunacy to claim that Russia would be interested in invading Sweden anytime soon.
But they're still saying it. They're saying Putin wants to go all the way, even today.
Because they have to keep the flame burning. I mean, the people of, especially, I mean, Sweden, I live here in Sweden, and I know Swedish internal politics. In order to be able to continue to send these huge amounts of money to Ukraine, and in order to be able to invest these huge amounts of money in the Swedish military industry, which perhaps, as you know, the Swedish military industry is quite substantial considering Sweden's quite small size as a country. In order to be able to send our taxpayers' money to these endeavors, they have to continue to scare us with the old Russian bear. It's nothing new. It always happens. It's just sad that you can't break through the propaganda circus.
I also understand that President Trump is going to be decreasing the amount of military aid for countries that border Russia or close to Russia in the Nordic region. How has this been received by your government and other governments nearby? Is it emboldening them in their anti-Russia and their Russophobia and their need to protect themselves from the always looming Russian threat, or has this kind of been a reality check?
It further emboldens our northern and Baltic nations, most definitely. It further sends the signals to our governments here within the coalition of the willing to invest more into our own military and into our so-called defensive apparatus. So right now we are at Finland and the Baltic states, and I believe Sweden will soon be leaving the convention on banning personnel landmines, and we will start to mine the border towards Russia once again. So there is no view that America is withdrawing. Perhaps we should be looking for a negotiated settlement so that we're not stuck facing Russia alone. Nothing of the sort is being discussed. So rather than stopping the bloodshed and acknowledging the military and political realities, we're waving the flag and our flags and looking for a continued fight with Russia. So no settlement. It's still a stated goal that the full liberation of all Ukrainian territories are needed from the side of the European nations involved in this. So when Trump said this, it wasn't heeded as a warning. It was more used as a rallying cry to further be able to enable the possibility of us to spend more taxpayers' money on defense and on offensive materials.
One of the funniest parts of the phone call that Trump had with the coalition of the willing was this statement that came out. It was one of the main headlines. Trump said, we really think that Europe should wean off of the Russian oil and gas, and particularly the gas because, Russian oil is only coming through India. But he said, you really need to do this. And everyone in Europe took this to mean that, Trump is, he's so correct. And this is all about draining Putin's war machine. But when I looked at this, I saw it. I'm like, this is just Trump saying, we demand that you further entrench yourselves in Europe to our very costly American gas contracts. We are demanding that you never look back at Russia and only buy American gas and through our pipelines and our, LNG paths that we send over. So what do you make of this? Because I think in Europe and in Ukraine, there's like No reality breaking through with these people that this has nothing to do with draining Putin's war machine. It's just about boosting the shareholder profits of these major energy companies in the United States who seek to establish new long-term contracts with European partners.
It's most definitely a matter of boosting the profits. Europe have been we're basically self-hating bunch of nations right now. We've been buying Russian gas through India and paying more for it for a long time. And the oil, it's still been we've been getting the oil. Sorry, we've been getting the oil from India, Russian oil from India, and also we're building new facilities in order to be able to receive American liquid nitrogen gas tankers. I think in Amsterdam and was it Germany? Anyway, we're building these new terminals in order to facilitate American transported gas, which has to come from across the Atlantic, which is obviously going to cost us a lot more, considering that Europe geographically is very much stuck on the Eurasian continent. So what Europe has done is we have decoupled from Russian energy. The thought was that this will bring Russia to its knees. Obviously, it hasn't. As I think you have seen, Jackson, about a week ago, Russia and China met in the summit in China, Shenyang, and there they decided and signed an agreement on a new pipeline across Siberia, through Mongolia, and into China. So instead of Ukraine being the country of transit and gaining at least some income from being this country of transit, Russia has moved, allowing Mongolia to become the country of transit and allowing China to be the receiver of relatively cheap energy, which the European Union no longer is not, because we're so hell-bent on pleasing Washington and the people in charge in Washington, which may or may not be Trump. That's always a matter of debate. But anyway, we're happily paying a dividend to America in order to gain energy at a much higher price, which means our industry is quickly coming to its knees. Instead of bringing Russia to their knees, we're bringing ourselves and our industries to our knees, which is, as I said, a very self-hating policy on behalf of the European Union.
Mats, as a final question for you, if Trump's goal here is to weaken Europe and make them dependent upon the United States, we already saw that the EU cut off the Chinese trade routes through Poland. We saw that, of course, a long time ago, the Nord Stream pipeline was blown up, so the gas is cut off. Europe is not looking back towards China or Russia. It's very foolish, but that's the truth. And Trump wants them weak, so they are dependent upon the U.S. Given this is the case, wouldn't it make sense that it is in the best interest of Donald Trump to maybe negotiate with Russia behind the scenes, say, look, we're not a part of this, but allow Europe to do whatever stupid, crazy things they want to do with this coalition of the willing? Because at the end of the day, it's only going to make them weaker. It's only going to make them more dependent upon the United States. It's only going to further sever their relations with China, Russia, and the multipolar world into the an indefinite future. Wouldn't this be exactly what Trump actually wants if he wants a dependent Europe?
Of course. And I think as a national policy, America and the United States under Trump are doing some mighty fine moves. If you look at it from an egocentrical point of view, which of course all international politics are egocentric on behalf of the fact that you should strengthen your own nation's position. especially in a multipolar world. So the fact that the European Union is going to become weaker, but in the meantime paying a lot of its profits to the United States, while the United States maintain at least somewhat of a dialogue with Russia, is obviously something that's going to make in the short term and perhaps in the medium term America a bit more prosperous. Because in Europe, the official Ukrainian narrative of the heroic struggle against the unprovoked genocidal Russia is just going to continue playing, and nothing can complicate this easy black and white picture. So I think it's no single event is going to decouple the coalition of the willing or the European Union from the fight with Russia. So Trump he's mighty smart. He's doing goodly, as he would say himself, by having the European Union doing the fight for him while he concentrates on other issues. For example, if he wants to end the dependence on Saudi Arabia and instead gain Venezuelan oil areas, he can focus on that, basically returning to an old principle of South America being the main focus of North America or the United States interests, in accordance with the classical Monroe Doctrine. So Trump is, he's no idiot. He's erratic, yes, of course, but he's no fool. The only fool right now are the politicians within the European Union and the nation states of Europe.
I couldn't agree more. Mats Nilsson, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much.